The Lions of Iwo Jima, the story of Combat Team 28 and the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. By Major General Fred Haynes, USMC, retired, and James A. Warren. Narrated by Michael Prichard. Copyright 2008 by Major General Fred Haynes, USMC, retired, and James A. Warren. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Henry Holt and Company, LLC, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Preface. March 8, 2006. Two men stand just above a long crescent beach on a small volcanic island 650 miles south of Tokyo. It is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a beautiful day to explore hallowed ground. A 7-knot wind blows out of the south. The surf gently breaks on Green Beach, Iwo Jima, where, 61 years earlier, the 4,500 Marines of Combat Team 28 landed. Their mission, to seize a 554-foot mountain, Mount Surabachi, that dominated the full length of the beach, and then to join with 7 other combat teams to wrest the entire island from its 22,000 defenders. Iwo Jima, in February 1945, was the most densely fortified piece of real estate on Earth. The sound of the surf is broken only by the occasional plaintive cry of a seabird. The younger man wears a Marine-issue bush hat and carries a small tape recorder. The older one, slightly stooped, holds a cane in one hand and gesticulates toward the shoreline below. The two men gaze from north to south along the beach. To the north, a natural quarry looms over the beach. In the center, there is nothing but the terraced beach of black sand. To the south, rising up like the head of some primordial sea creature, is the mountain. Dusty green foliage obscures cave entrances at the mountain's base. Even from a distance of 400 yards, the craters of countless large-caliber projectiles are visible on the mountain's face. The older man is a retired major general in the Marines named Fred Haynes, this book's senior author. He was one of a small number of men in Regimental Combat Team 28, CT-28, to survive the entire battle without a single wound, and one of a handful of regimental staff officers responsible for planning the assault on Mount Surabachi. He speaks to the man in the bush hat, his co-author James A. Warren, a military historian who has written, among other books, a history of the Marines. Fred begins. I'd recently received my regular commission as a Marine, and had worked harder in preparing for this operation than for anything I had done before in my 24 years. I had been in the Corps for 2 years, but had never seen combat. I felt something similar to how I'd felt back home in Plano, Texas, just before a big high school football game. It's difficult to describe, really. My brother Doc used to call it feeling heavy in the pants. It was an odd mixture of anticipation and excitement, mixed with fear of what I might run up against and some apprehension as to how I'd respond under what was sure to be heavy fire. Of course, we'd used live fire in countless training exercises, but that was meant to reproduce the sights and sounds of combat and instill in us a measure of the seriousness of our job. It wasn't meant to kill people, unlike the fire we were about to receive on the beach at Iwo Jima. The first unpleasant surprise was the black, volcanic sand. Your feet sank deep into it with each step, and it was all but impossible to gain traction. Enemy fire at that point was heating up. The big stuff was joining the chorus of mortar and small arms fire we'd been taking since the first amphibious tractors came ashore at 0900. It was bedlam in every direction, real pandemonium, front, rear, and on both flanks. I flopped down on the second of the beach's 3 terraces next to a warrant officer named Joe Bush, who commanded our rocket section. Joe and I started to dig in right there, in part because the fire was increasing and in part because we needed to gain our bearings before moving forward, something we knew we had to do and fast. I didn't know where our command post, CP, would be, as I could find neither Colonel Liversedge nor Lieutenant Colonel Williams. We needed one of them to set up the CP to run the fight. Anyway, Joe and I were there not more than a minute or two when a few rounds from a Japanese machine gun went stitch, 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 about 1.5 feet in front of us. My first thought was, isn't this strange? They're shooting at us. But this wasn't exactly true. They were just firing in every direction, and these particular rounds, well, they came pretty close to severing our heads. I thought of Kipling's old ballad, Gunga Din. It was din, 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 with bullets kicking dust spots on the green. I also remember thinking that maybe I'd made the wrong career move. I'd been active in the church around that time and had thought about joining the priesthood. I soon had other causes for concern. Colonel Williams had suggested I get a couple of extra sandwiches from the ship's galley the previous night, as we weren't likely to get anything decent by way of chow on the first day ashore. So I did just that, but the sandwiches were lost somewhere on the beach, probably not far from where those machine gun rounds landed. The next thing that happened was very grim, but it was the sort of event that was happening up and down that beach all day. And although I wasn't aware of it at the time, it turned out to be a gruesome metaphor for the entire 36-day battle. An artillery round must have blown a couple of Marines to bits to our left, and a foot and a part of a calf, with legging and combat shoe attached, landed just a few meters away. I told one of our runners, a former Trappist monk novitiate named Len Bolkowski, take that over to the regimental surgeon at the aid station. Maybe he can match it to a casualty. Fred Haynes pauses for a moment and takes a long, hard look up and down the beach, and then faces south to the mountain. He spoke slowly, a slight hint of emotion in his Texas drawl. The intensity of the combat on Iwo was governed by the very close confinement of the battlefield and the sheer density of the fortifications on the island. Within a couple of days on that little rock, Iwo Jima is only about 8.5 square miles, we had 100,000 men trying with the utmost resolve to kill one another. That's more than 10,000 men per square mile. The Marines had been in some horrific fighting and suffered heavy casualties in World War I and on island battlefields in the Pacific in World War II. But what happened on Iwo was beyond description. It was a close-in slugging match of Marine infantry against hundreds of mutually reinforcing, heavily fortified positions manned by soldiers who preferred death to surrender, even when surrounded and with no hope of escape. It was a battle of Marine flesh against Japanese concrete in a very real sense. This slugging match went on day after day for 5 weeks. We had trained hard for close to a full year as a combat team. That's about double the time a typical Marine unit would spend in preparation for an operation in World War II. We knew our business. The Japanese surely knew theirs. It's hard for me to imagine now how anybody got out alive when you consider the sheer density of shells flying around that island hour after hour, day after day. By the time we reached the final pocket of Japanese resistance in Bloody Gorge near the north end of the rock, a month after we had landed, virtually all the guys who'd done the frontline fighting and taking Mount Surabachi were dead or wounded. The replacements were doing most of the fighting by then, and they were really getting plastered. Some of the Marines who had been in it from the beginning stopped caring about safety. They were too tired to care, and yet they refused to quit. It was not uncommon for wounded men up there in that deep gash in the earth to refuse evacuation or to escape the hospital after sustaining 2 or even 3 wounds in order to rejoin their buddies still on the line. The thought of being killed in combat was for many of our Marines preferable to leaving their buddies to carry on without them. There was never anything quite like Iwo Jima in the annals of American arms before, and with any luck we won't see anything like it again. As Haynes talks, an active-duty Marine and decorated veteran of the Iraq War, Colonel Stacy Clardy, walks below the general with the former Combat Team 28 machine gunner Gordon Schnull of Elgin, Illinois, who is reading from a sheet of paper the names of 15 Marines from his hometown who fought on Iwo Jima. 5 of these men lost their lives there. Colonel Clardy snaps to attention. Other visitors to the landing beaches quietly gather black volcanic sand into plastic Ziploc bags. Though the detritus of battle is plentiful here, beach sand is the only souvenir that the Japanese, to whom the island was returned in 1968, allow visitors to remove. Spent shells and even live rounds can be found if one wanders just a short way off the paths and roads, or enters the many caves, tunnels, and underground barracks that housed thousands of Japanese soldiers. The mood on the beach is solemn and elegiac. The plaintive calls of gulls and the lapping of the waves are the only sounds one hears. Introduction. Many military historians today regard the attack on the island fortress of Iwo Jima as the supreme test of the amphibious assault in the annals of war. 3 reinforced divisions of Marines and their supporting forces, some 110,000 men in all, not counting the massive numbers of men manning the ships and planes surrounding the island, assaulted the Japanese on February 19, 1945. From its formal inception in October 1944, the operation to wrest Iwo Jima from its defenders was considered by American planners to be potentially the most difficult mission in the 170-year history of the Marine Corps. The campaign itself, fought between February 19th and March 26, 1945, proved the planners entirely correct. The battle, in the end, took 36 days of unceasingly ferocious combat. Most of the killing was at close range by infantrymen and demolitions men wielding rifles, flamethrowers, and explosive charges designed to blow up gun emplacements and the underground tunnels and caves that comprised the Japanese defensive system. 1/3 of the 19,000 Marines who were killed in World War II died on Iwo Jima. Operation Detachment, the official name of the operation, was the sole campaign in the Pacific in which total American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese. The fortifications on the island were the most elaborate encountered by Allied infantrymen in the Pacific. Because Iwo Jima was so small and the combatants so numerous, the battlefield was intensely cramped. During the first 2 weeks of the fight, there was no safe place, no rear area that could not be reached by Japanese guns. The Japanese fighting positions ranged from one-man spider holes to pillboxes, dug-in tanks, blockhouses, trenches, and interconnected cave openings. They were scattered throughout the island, but camouflage rendered the vast majority undetectable. The commander of the Japanese forces was a superb professional soldier. A lieutenant general, Tadamichi Kurebayashi, was a 5th-generation samurai and a gifted defensive strategist. He had long admired the United States and believed the decision to initiate war against the Americans a grave mistake. Nonetheless, for 8 months before the invasion, Kurebayashi drove his garrison at a furious pace. They prepared a lethal system of interlocking defenses across the entire island. More than 900 major gun emplacements and several thousand individual fighting positions were supplied by a network of underground barracks and storehouses, connected by 11 miles of tunnels. The Japanese garrison on Iwo waged one of the greatest campaigns of static defense in the history of war, exacting and paying an enormous price in blood. Avoiding the large-scale, costly banzai attacks that had featured prominently in earlier battles, the Japanese instead chose to adhere, as a V-amphibious corps, V Corps or VAC, the senior military command echelon on the island, report put it, to a well-coordinated plan by a commander who has prepared his defensive positions and utilized the terrain to the best tactical advantage in order to conserve his force, inflict heavy casualties on the enemy, and delay the capture of this strategic island. Each Jap defender was given the mission of killing 10 Americans before dying himself. The gravity of the coming battle filled me with apprehension, wrote Lieutenant General Holland Howland Mad Smith, who, in leading the Marines in their drive across the Pacific, had become a symbol of the Corps' fighting spirit. Smith had predicted at least 15,000 casualties among the landing force. Before the landing, the V Amphibious Corps believed the enemy bastion on Iwo to number about 14,000 men. In fact, there were close to 22,000 defenders. The Americans suffered 28,000 casualties, while fewer than 2,000 Japanese survived the battle. I was not afraid of the outcome. I knew we would win, wrote Smith. We always had. But the contemplation of the cost in lives caused me many sleepless nights. My only source of comfort was in reading the tribulations of leaders described in the Bible. Never before had I realized the spiritual uplift and solace a man on the eve of a great trial receives from the pages of that book. Great trial, indeed. On Iwo Jima there would be no flanking attacks or amphibious assaults behind enemy lines designed to crack the thick belt of defensive positions from the rear. There could be no end run around the enemy. The island was too thickly fortified to undertake such maneuvers, which have traditionally limited both casualties and the duration of large battles. For the assault troops, Iwo Jima was, from beginning to end, a matter of frontal assault against an enemy who resisted attacks almost to the last man. Beginning on December 8, 1944, and continuing for the next 74 consecutive days, the island was bombarded by B-24 Liberators of the 7th Army Air Force. The island received by far the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. Yet an official intelligence report issued 2 weeks before the battle confirmed that the daily bombings only served to slow down the furious pace with which Kuribayashi and his men were digging in and building new positions. Photographic evidence of the bombings between December 3rd and January 24th, an American intelligence report made clear, had not prevented the enemy from improving his defensive position. And as of 24 January 1945, his installations of all categories of fortifications had notably increased in number. The island is now far more heavily defended by gun positions and field fortifications than it was on 15 October 1944, when initial heavy bombing strikes were initiated. It was Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, who proposed the strategic directive to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, that led to the island's seizure. On October 2, 1944, he issued a directive indicating that the Navy lacked the resources to sustain the provisionally scheduled invasions of Formosa and China. The JCS had envisaged constructing air bases on both to conduct a massive strategic bombing campaign against Japan proper. King argued that the Navy did, however, have sufficient resources to take intermediate air bases on the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and that their seizure would greatly enhance the strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands from bases already established in the Marianas. General Henry Hap Arnold, who led the Army Air Forces, ardently supported the directive. Iwo Jima, in particular, could be used as a base for long-range P-51 fighter escorts for the massive B-29 superfortress raids designed to destroy Japan's capacity to make war. The island was equidistant from Tokyo and the B-29 air bases on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. It already had 2 airfields suitable for use by fighters. The capture of Iwo would eliminate the 2-hour warning of impending attack from the island's radio station. With fighter escort protection and without the fuel-wasting dogleg around the island, the B-29s could fly in low over their critical targets in Japan. On October 3rd, the JCS accepted King's proposal. There was a secondary reason for taking the island. Japanese bombers flying from Iwo had already succeeded in destroying more than a dozen B-29s on American airfields in the Marianas. If the Japanese opted to replenish their air armada on Iwo Jima, most of which had been destroyed by American air raids, they could continue to punish American air bases and their most precious assets, the superfortresses themselves. The JCS also saw Iwo Jima as a staging area for the invasion of the home islands, and an airbase from which American planes could cut off shipping in the Sea of Japan. Once the strategic bombing campaign began in November 1944, the wisdom of the decision to take the island was confirmed in a compelling, unanticipated way. Far too many B-29s returning from the raids on Japan were ditching into the sea, often with the loss of all hands on board. With Iwo Jima in American hands, the damaged superfortresses could land on the island for repairs and then fly back to the Marianas. Possession of Iwo's airfields gave Army Air Forces General Curtis LeMay, who commanded 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas, and his B-29 crews an enormous boost in morale. More than 2,200 B-29s landed on Iwo Jima by war's end. Not all of these crews would have been lost at sea. Some landings were for training purposes only. But it seems reasonable to assume that several thousand American lives were saved because of tiny Iwo Jima's airstrips. Moreover, the long-range P-51 fighters that were placed on the island made an important, if largely unheralded, contribution to the destruction of enemy air power in Japan proper. Recently, a historian and active-duty Marine captain, Robert S. Burrell, has published several controversial articles and a book arguing that the irony is that the battle's impact on the history of the Corps far surpasses any strategic relevance capturing the island may have served. Implicitly, Burrell suggests that the cost in blood of taking the island was too high, given its strategic contribution to the defeat of Japan, and that the decision to take Iwo Jima was essentially a strategic miscalculation. Captain Burrell's work, we believe, sheds far more heat than light. It relies too heavily on hindsight and on a tenuous foundation of cherry-picked information and analysis unavailable in the fall of 1944. The capture of Iwo did, in the end, greatly enhance the strategic bombing of the home islands. That bombing campaign was clearly decisive in Japan's defeat, for it threatened to destroy Japanese civilization, and thus paved the way for the decision by Japan's leaders to surrender unconditionally to the United States. In assessing the strategic impact of taking the island, Burrell ignores the moral element of strategy deemed so vitally important by Karl von Clausewitz, the legendary Prussian philosopher of war. By moral, Clausewitz posited immeasurable non-material factors such as morale, willpower, and a nation's unity of purpose in carrying on despite extreme adversity. Here, we believe the effect of Iwo Jima on both nations was profound. The loss of the island, the first piece of Japanese soil invaded, and the first target in the inner defensive ring protecting the home islands, stunned the Japanese people, for they viewed it as the gateway to Japan itself. Its loss led the Imperial Japanese Army to conclude that though they might fight on, there was no way they could successfully repulse additional amphibious assaults by the Americans. Further, the stoicism and courage of the Marines, symbolized in the iconic Joe Rosenthal photograph of the second flag-raising on Mount Surabachi, gave the war-weary American public a much-needed boost when morale was clearly low, providing a palpable sense of optimism that the defeat of the Japanese was inevitable. Historians are in general agreement that the high casualties sustained on Iwo Jima and Okinawa were a critical factor in President Harry Truman's decision to try to end the war by means other than an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Military historian John Keegan puts the projected casualty figure for the invasion of the island of Kyushu alone, an invasion in which Combat Team 28 was slated to participate, at 268,000 men killed and wounded, a staggering number when one acknowledges that American battle deaths in all theaters in World War II totaled 292,000. In the American imagination, Iwo Jima joins Lexington and Concord in the battles of New Orleans, Gettysburg, Belleau Wood, and Normandy as one of a handful of military engagements that transcend the war of which they were a part and that speak powerfully to our sense of national identity. When photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the stirring image of 5 Marines and a Navy medical corpsman raising the American flag atop Mount Surabachi, the place of Regimental Combat Team 28 in the annals of American history was assured. The Lions of Iwo Jima is the first full history of that combat team's costly struggle on Hell's volcano. The story of the flag raisings, there were in fact 2 such events, has generated an enormous body of writing and recently a major feature film. It beckons to us today, reminding us of the sacrifices men and women have had to make in perilous times. But very little is known about the unit's fate after the flag went up. The Lions of Iwo Jima seeks to recapture the experiences of the 4,500 Marines of Combat Team 28, placing particular focus not just on the opening struggle to seize Mount Surabachi, but on the month-long assault after the famous flag raising. During the fight against the main belt of enemy defenses, amid the lethal tunnel and bunker complexes of Hill 362A and Nishi Ridge, CT-28 sustained a devastating number of casualties among its junior officers and seasoned non-coms. Once those objectives were secured, the team, its assault units increasingly manned by replacements with limited infantry training, struggled forward against hundreds of well-prepared defenses, yard by yard, north toward Kitano Point. With the help of the remnants of CT-26 and CT-27, CT-28 cleared out the last bastion of the organized resistance on the island, hidden in a deep gash in the volcanic earth christened Bloody Gorge. The gorge measured only 700 yards in length and between 200 and 500 yards in width. Yet it took the exhausted Marines 9 days of brutal combat in the worst terrain on the island to clear out the labyrinth of subterranean defenses there. The last phase of the battle lent credence to General Smith's assertion that Iwo Jima was troglodyte war on a primitive level, with modern refinements that burned men to ashes, blasted through concrete masses, split the earth with seismic effect, entombing thousands alive. Hill 362A, Nishi Ridge, and Bloody Gorge, each a battle within the battle, are remembered only by a few hundred survivors and a handful of military historians. This book aims to remedy that situation. The question might well be asked, why another book on Iwo Jima when so many have been written already? Because the complete story of CT-28 has never been told, and its history, we believe, presents a fresh perspective of the battle in which it played such a crucial role. Earlier histories of the battle offer only bits and pieces of Combat Team 28's campaign, and without exception they focus on the team's first phase of the fight, with its 2 flag raisings. This is not surprising, given the Rosenthal photo's enormous symbolic value, as well as the tactical importance of the first. Surabachi was a fortress unto itself, with multiple levels of tunnels and numerous large-caliber gun emplacements. It completely dominated the landing beaches, with a garrison of more than 1,600 Japanese soldiers capable of raining down all manner of fire upon the Marine invasion force. Surabachi had to be taken fast. By the time CT-28 had broken through the main defenses on the left flank of the island-wide attack and reached Bloody Gorge, the team teetered on the verge of collapse. Yet it somehow pressed on until the last enemy defensive positions were reduced.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?